My wife spent 20 years restoring that car. When I found the garage empty, my son looked me in the eye and said he sold it because his wife wanted a luxury trip to Dubai. I was completely devastated until a local dealership owner called me and said my wife left something hidden inside the dashboard and that I needed to come down immediately. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled my son's entire life from my living room, let me know which state you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful child a lesson they will never forget. The drive home from the cardiology clinic was supposed to be a quiet relief. The doctor had given me a clean bill of health, an encouraging update 6 months after the mild heart attack that had briefly turned my world upside down. I pulled my sensible daily commuter sedan onto the familiar paved driveway of the home I had shared with my wife Sarah for nearly 4 decades. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. I pressed the worn button on the sun visor. The heavy motorized garage door groaned and began its slow ascent. I waited for the familiar gleam of candy apple red paint to reflect the afternoon light. Instead, the rising door revealed nothing but a vast expanse of bare, cold concrete. I put the car in park and stepped out, leaving my door wide open. The visceral shock hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My breath caught in my throat. The garage was perfectly organized, just as Sarah had left it before she passed away. Her meticulously arranged toolboxes lined the back wall. The specialized wrenches and hydraulic jacks sat in their designated places. But the center of the room, the space that had housed her crowning achievement, was entirely empty. The scent of heavy engine oil and her favorite premium leather polish still hung thickly in the stagnant air. A single rectangular oil drip pan lay useless on the floor. Her 1969 Mustang Mach 1 was gone. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. I checked the side window of the garage door. The glass was intact. I checked the heavy deadbolt on the side entry door. It was completely secure, with no signs of forced entry. Panic began to claw at the edges of my rational thought. Someone had bypassed the security system entirely. Someone had driven away with a piece of automotive history, a vehicle that represented thousands of hours of my late wife's grease-stained dedication and unyielding passion. The silence in the empty garage was deafening. I gripped the handle of the door leading into the house, my knuckles turning white as I prepared to call the police and report a catastrophic theft. I stepped through the mudroom and into the hallway. The house was not empty. The house was. The eerie calm of this garage was immediately shattered by the sound of hushed voices and the rich aroma of my expensive imported coffee brewing in the kitchen. I rounded the corner, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. 2 massive hard-shell designer suitcases sat directly in the middle of the hallway, blocking the path to the front door. They were the kind of expensive luggage that practically screamed careless wealth. I stepped into the kitchen. My son Matthew stood leaning casually against the granite countertop. He was scrolling through his smartphone with an expression of mild boredom. Beside him stood his wife Amanda. She was sipping coffee from the hand-painted ceramic mug that Sarah had bought during our trip to Santa Fe over a decade ago. Amanda wore a pristine silk travel outfit, looking entirely out of place in the kitchen my wife had designed. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. In fact, Matthew simply glanced up from his screen and let out a heavy sigh, acting as if my early return from the doctor was a minor inconvenience to his schedule. I did not offer a greeting. My voice shook not with fear, but with a rising, incomprehensible rage that I struggled to contain. I pointed a trembling finger toward the hallway leading to the garage and demanded to know where the car was. I expected confusion. I expected Matthew to drop his phone and rush outside to see the empty space. I expected panic. Instead, Matthew calmly locked his phone screen and slipped it into his tailored jacket pocket. He took a slow sip of my coffee, met my furious gaze without a single ounce of hesitation, and delivered a sentence that shattered my entire reality. He brazenly admitted that he sold it. He did not stutter. He did not look away. He stated it as a simple matter of fact, as if he had cleared out a box of old newspapers from the attic. I demanded to know how that was legally possible. The title to the Mustang was locked in a heavy steel safe in my home office. It was solely in my name after Sarah passed. Matthew set his mug down on the counter and offered a condescending smile. He reminded me of the terrifying week I spent in the intensive care unit 6 months ago, while I was hooked up to monitors worried about my survival. Matthew had brought in a lawyer and a notary. He convinced me to sign a general power of attorney so he could manage the mortgage payments and handle the household bills if the worst were to happen. I had trusted my only child with my life and my livelihood. Matthew revealed that he had taken that document straight to a vintage automotive broker downtown. He used the legal authority I granted him in a moment of mortal vulnerability to authorize a duplicate title and transfer ownership of the Mach 1. He bypassed me entirely. He forged ahead with the sale of my wife's legacy trading, 20 years of her sweat and devotion for a direct wire transfer into his personal bank account. When I demanded to know why he would commit such a profound betrayal, his justification was even more sickening. He gestured toward the massive suitcases in the hallway. He stated that it was his 5th wedding anniversary. He claimed that Amanda deserved a lavish extended vacation to Dubai. He looked me dead in the eye and said the car was just rusting away under a tarp, taking up valuable space. He argued that since he was my sole heir, the car would eventually belong to him anyway. In his twisted mind, he was simply taking an early advance on his inheritance to fund a luxury trip to the Middle East. He spoke of my wife's masterpiece as if it were a meaningless pile of scrap metal that he had brilliantly converted into first-class airline tickets and a penthouse hotel suite. Before I could fully process the sheer audacity of his confession, Amanda decided to add her own layer of emotional cruelty. She set Sarah's favorite mug in the sink with a loud clatter. She crossed her arms and glared at me aggressively, defending her husband's thievery. She insulted my age directly to my face. She told me I was nearly 70 years old and had no business trying to handle a heavy manual transmission clutch anyway. She claimed I was a safety hazard on the road and that they had actually done me a massive favor by removing a dangerous temptation from the property. Her voice grew sharper, dripping with venom and profound entitlement. She looked around the kitchen, her eyes scanning the walls and the furniture, as if she were inspecting a property she planned to demolish. She told me that I needed to move on. She demanded that I use the 3 weeks they would be lounging in Dubai to finally clear out the rest of the house. She instructed me to buy heavy-duty garbage bags and throw away Sarah's clothes, her remaining tools, and her useless trinkets. She called my home a depressing mausoleum and told me to get over it. The disrespect was so complete, so perfectly executed, that it felt like the air had been violently sucked out of the room. I stood paralyzed on the hardwood floor. The magnitude of the betrayal anchored my feet to the ground. My only son had stolen my most prized possession, exploited my medical emergency to commit fraud, and his wife had essentially spit on my dead wife's memory. The urge to physically throw them out of my house warred with the staggering disbelief short-circuiting my brain. I reached a shaking hand into my pocket. My fingers closed around the cold metal of my cell phone. I made the absolute decision to dial the authorities. I decided in that fraction of a second that I did not care if my son missed his flight or if he went to jail in his designer clothes. Before my thumb could unlock the screen, the phone violently vibrated in my hand. An unknown local number flashed brightly across the display. Pure instinct drove me to answer it, perhaps hoping it was the broker who bought the car. I pressed the phone to my ear. A man's voice came through the speaker, breathless and urgently demanding to know if he was speaking to Daniel. He introduced himself as Leon, the owner of the high-end vintage dealership downtown. Leon did not sound like a man who had just closed a lucrative deal. He sounded nervous. Leon told me that he had purchased the car from Matthew earlier that morning. He explained that his detailing crew was currently prepping the vehicle for a massive private auction scheduled for the following day. But while they were deep cleaning the interior, they found something that halted the entire process. Leon explained that there was a custom-built false panel hidden deep behind the glove box, something that did not match any original factory specifications. When they removed it, they found something bolted inside. Leon dropped his voice to a hushed whisper. He told me that my wife had left something hidden inside the dashboard, something with my name written boldly across it. He told me to drop whatever I was doing and get to his garage immediately. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. The call disconnected. I looked up. Matthew and Amanda had already turned their backs to me. They grabbed the telescopic handles of their massive luxury suitcases. The heavy plastic wheels clicked rhythmically against the floorboards as they confidently marched toward the front door. Matthew casually shouted over his shoulder, telling me not to wait up and promising to send a postcard from the desert. I did not say a single word. I did not move to stop them. The paralyzing shock had completely vanished, instantly replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The immediate crisis was no longer stopping their flight to the United Arab Emirates. The crisis was getting to Leon's garage before the buyer took the car away forever. Matthew and Amanda walked out the front door, utterly oblivious to the massive, devastating trap they had just left behind. They thought they had won. They had no idea they were walking straight into their own destruction. The drive downtown blurred into a single continuous stretch of asphalt and green traffic lights. I navigated my quiet sedan through the late afternoon traffic with a singular burning focus. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. I did not turn on the radio. I needed the absolute silence to organize the chaos exploding in my mind. The route to the vintage automotive district was entirely familiar. Sarah and I used to drive this exact path on Sunday mornings, looking for rare replacement parts at specialty swap meets. Now every intersection felt like a countdown clock ticking toward a permanent loss. The sheer arrogance of my son attempting to fence a priceless family heirloom like a stolen television set fueled every press of the accelerator. I bypassed the main commercial avenue and took the industrial backroads to cut valuable minutes off the travel time. Leon operated out of a massive refurbished brick warehouse on the edge of the financial district. It was not a dusty mechanic shop filled with stray oil pans and discarded tires. It was a high-end gallery designed for millionaires who wanted to buy perfectly restored pieces of automotive history. I pulled my car aggressively into the visitor parking space and killed the engine. The massive glass storefront windows displayed pristine classic vehicles resting on polished white epoxy floors. I pushed through the heavy glass entry door. The air inside was climate-controlled and smelled faintly of expensive carnauba wax and specialized leather conditioner. There was no background music playing. The sterile silence of the showroom floor felt entirely wrong for machines built to roar. Leon was waiting for me near the reception desk. He was a tall man with graying hair, who possessed a deep reverence for classic engineering. He did not offer a polite greeting or extend his hand for a shake. He simply gave a brief nod and gestured for me to follow him past the main display area. We walked toward the secure detailing bays located in the back of the building. We stepped through a set of double doors into a brilliantly lit workspace. There she was. The candy apple red paint of the 1969 Mustang Mach-1 gleamed violently under the harsh fluorescent overhead lights. Seeing the car sitting there away from our home garage felt like finding a loved one trapped in a hospital room. The aggressive lines of the hood and the flawless chrome bumpers were a direct testament to 2 decades of my wife dedicating her weekends to absolute perfection. Sarah had rebuilt the massive engine block with her own hands. She had sourced every original wire and authentic factory bolt. Now her crowning achievement was sitting in a sterile commercial bay with a detailing towel draped over the windshield, waiting to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. A wave of profound grief washed over me rapidly, followed by a sharp, protective instinct. Leon stopped a few feet away from the driver's side door and crossed his arms. He looked incredibly uncomfortable. He explained that his lead technician was preparing the interior for a comprehensive deep clean when he noticed an inconsistency. Leon knew the factory specifications of the 1969 Mach 1 perfectly. He stated that the passenger side dashboard had a subtle modification that no assembly line worker in Detroit had ever installed. The glove box area was slightly shallower than it should be. Leon admitted he initially thought it was a poorly executed repair job from a previous owner until he inspected the metalwork closely. He recognized the precision. He told me the fabrication was flawless and required a level of custom machining that only a master mechanic could execute. He knew my wife was a master mechanic. We walked around to the passenger side of the vehicle. Leon opened the heavy door. The distinct smell of the vintage interior rushed out to meet me. He leaned inside and pointed a small tactical flashlight up under the curve of the dashboard, deep behind the primary glove compartment. I knelt on the pristine epoxy floor and looked up into the dark cavity. Tucked away, completely invisible from a casual passenger, was a secondary metal plate secured by 4 unusual fasteners. They were not standard Phillips or flathead screws. They were specialized tamper-proof security bolts. Leon reached into his heavy canvas apron and pulled out a custom-machined socket attachment. He handed the cold, heavy piece of metal to me. He stepped back and told me that whatever was hidden behind that plate belonged to my family, and he was not going to be the man who broke the seal. I gripped the specialized tool in my right hand and took a slow, deep breath. I reached under the dashboard to uncover the final secret my wife had left behind. I shifted my weight on the hard epoxy floor and angled my shoulders to fit beneath the passenger side dashboard. The space was incredibly cramped. The scent of old vinyl and wiring surrounded me. I guided the custom socket attachment toward the first tamper-proof bolt, holding the false metal plate in place. The heavy tool slipped perfectly over the strange groove. I applied a firm counterclockwise pressure. The bolt resisted for a fraction of a second before giving way with a sharp metallic snap. The sound echoed loudly in the cavernous detailing bay. I turned the wrench slowly. The threads were perfectly lubricated. Even in her secret modifications, my wife had maintained absolute mechanical perfection. Sarah never did anything halfway. If she was going to build a hidden compartment inside a classic muscle car, she was going to engineer it to outlast a nuclear blast. I moved the tool to the second bolt. My knuckles scraped against the rough edge of the undercarriage, but I hardly felt the sting. My entire focus narrowed down to the rotating steel. As I worked, a profound realization began to settle heavy in my chest. Sarah had not built this compartment for fun. She had not designed a custom security plate to store spare fuses or an extra set of keys. She had deliberately engineered an impenetrable vault inside her most prized possession. She had gone to extreme lengths to ensure that whoever sat in the passenger seat would never know it was there. She was hiding something. More importantly, she was hiding something from the people who had unrestricted access to our home. She was hiding something from our son. The third bolt came loose and dropped softly into the palm of my free hand. The thick metal plate shifted slightly downwards. I could feel the cold, heavy-gauge steel she had used to fabricate the false backing. I positioned the wrench over the final fastener. My breathing grew shallow. Up until this exact moment, I was just a grieving widower whose arrogant son had stolen a car. I was the victim of a cruel, opportunistic crime. But as I applied pressure to the last bolt, I felt a fundamental shift in my own identity. I was no longer just the victim of a theft. I was the man unlocking the final unread chapter of my wife's life. I gave the wrench one final hard twist, the last thread released. I caught the heavy metal plate before it could crash against the floorboards. I set it gently on the floor beside my knees. I aimed the small tactical flashlight directly into the dark, gaping cavity my wife had meticulously carved out behind the glove box. The space was completely lined with a dark, heat-resistant material. Resting perfectly flat inside the custom chamber was a thick silver envelope. It was not standard paper. It was a heavy-duty industrial-grade fireproof document bag sealed with a thick strip of reinforced security tape. I reached my hand into the dark space. The rough, textured material of the bag felt distinctly alien against the smooth, vintage vinyl of the car interior. I gripped the thick edges of the envelope and slowly pulled it free from its hiding place. The sheer weight of the package surprised me. It was dense. It felt incredibly substantial in my hands. I slid backwards across the polished floor and pulled myself up to a standing position. I clutched the silver envelope tightly against my chest. The physical extraction of this hidden object flipped a switch deep inside my mind. The paralyzing shock of finding my garage empty was completely eradicated. The sickening feeling of listening to my daughter-in-law insult my age evaporated into the sterile air of the commercial garage. Holding that heavy package, I felt my posture straighten. The trembling in my hands ceased entirely. I was holding a weapon my wife had forged in secret. I did not know what the documents contained yet, but I knew with absolute certainty that Sarah had prepared for this exact disaster. She had seen the greed festering inside our son long before my heart attack gave him the legal opportunity to strike. The dealership owner stood a few feet away, watching me with silent respect. He did not ask questions. He simply nodded toward a heavy stainless steel workbench resting against the far wall of the detailing bay. I walked over to the brightly lit station. Every step felt heavier and more deliberate than the last. The transition was complete. I was no longer the discarded old man left behind to clean out a dusty house while his ungrateful children flew first class to the Middle East. I was the executor of a devastating contingency plan. I placed the heavy fireproof envelope flat on the pristine metal surface of the workbench. The bright overhead lights reflected sharply off the silver material. The thick security tape securing the flap remained entirely intact. I stared down at the sealed package, knowing that breaking this seal would permanently alter the trajectory of all our lives. I reached for a heavy steel utility knife resting on the tool rack. I extended the sharp razor blade. I pressed the tip of the knife directly into the thick security tape and sliced it open. I reached inside the sliced opening of the fireproof bag and pulled out the contents. There were two distinct items resting on the cold steel of the workbench. The first was a thick stack of formal legal papers bound by a heavy brass clip. The second was a small notebook bound in dark brown leather. I recognized the notebook instantly. It was the exact brand of field journal Sarah used to carry when we went to classic car shows to catalog engine part numbers. I pushed the legal documents aside for a moment. My fingers traced the worn edge of the leather cover. I took a deep breath and opened the first page. The familiar, elegant loop of my wife's handwriting jumped off the paper and struck me right in the chest. But this was not a diary filled with fond memories or emotional reflections. It was a meticulous ledger of betrayal. The very first entry was dated 4 years ago. It detailed a discrepancy of $12,000 missing from our joint savings account. I remembered that incident perfectly. Matthew had convinced us that a rogue wire transfer had been intercepted by international hackers. He had even printed out fake bank correspondence to prove his story. Sarah had written the truth directly below the date. She had gone to the local branch in person. She had pulled the security footage and the raw transaction logs. She documented that Matthew had forged my signature on a withdrawal slip and transferred the exact amount to a private offshore account used for high-stakes sports betting. She attached a photocopy of the forged slip neatly folded between the pages. I turned the page and felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. The entries continued with chilling regularity. Each page represented a new lie and a new theft. 3 years ago, my mother's diamond tennis bracelet vanished from Sarah's jewelry box. Matthew had helped us search the entire house for 2 days. He had even called the police and filed a burglary report claiming someone must have slipped through the back door. The journal told the real story. Sarah had found the original pawnshop receipt tucked inside the pocket of Matthew's winter coat while doing the laundry. The date on the pawn ticket matched the exact week Matthew and Amanda purchased their brand new luxury sport utility vehicle. Sarah had taped the original pawn slip right onto the page. She noted that she chose not to confront him because my blood pressure had been dangerously high that month, and she refused to trigger a medical emergency over a piece of jewelry. The depth of her silent endurance was staggering. I flipped through dozens of pages chronicling stolen cash and unauthorized credit line increases and manipulated tax returns. I read about the time he claimed his small business was failing and begged us for a short-term loan. We gave him $30,000 from our retirement fund to save his company. Sarah discovered he used that exact money to pay off his massive personal gambling debts and buy a country club membership for his wife. He had not suddenly turned into a monster the day I went to the hospital. He had been a parasite feeding on our hard work for the better part of a decade. He had sat at our Thanksgiving table and smiled at us while actively draining our financial security. He had hugged his mother while wearing clothes bought with the money he stole from her bank accounts. The final entries in the journal were dated just a few weeks before Sarah passed away. The handwriting was slightly shaky, but the intent was absolute steel. She had uncovered his most ambitious crime yet. She discovered that Matthew had used my Social Security number to open 3 separate high-limit credit cards. He had maxed them all out to fund a risky real estate investment that eventually collapsed. He had intercepted the mail to hide the statements. Sarah had spent her final days quietly paying off those fraudulent debts, using the last of her personal inheritance so I would never find out. She absorbed his massive financial sins entirely on her own. She carried the weight of our son's criminal depravity to her grave, just to protect my failing heart. I reached the final page of the leather journal. The ink was dark and heavily pressed into the paper. It was a direct message written explicitly to me. Sarah wrote that she loved me more than life itself, but she knew my fatal flaw. She knew I would always try to forgive our son. She knew I would always try to find a rational excuse for his terrible behavior, because I was a good father. But she wrote that Matthew was not a good son. She stated clearly that he was a predator, who viewed our family solely as a financial resource to be exploited until nothing was left. She wrote that she could not die in peace knowing he would eventually leave me homeless and broken. The final sentence of the journal was a direct command. It told me to put down the notebook and read the legal document she had secured in the envelope. She promised me that she had built a permanent wall to protect our assets, and that the time had come for me to lock the gate. I closed the leather journal. The soft thump of the cover hitting the metal workbench sounded like a judge bringing down a gavel. I did not feel any lingering weakness. I did not feel any desire to call my son and beg for an explanation. The illusion of my family was completely shattered and replaced by a cold, mechanical certainty. My wife had spent her final months gathering bulletproof evidence of multiple felonies. She had engineered a flawless case against the man who was currently flying first class to Dubai on her dime. I reached across the illuminated metal surface of the workbench and pulled the heavy stack of legal documents toward me. I was completely ready to read the terms of my wife's final adjustment. I pushed the leather notebook aside. The thick stack of legal papers remained perfectly aligned under the heavy brass clip. The paper itself was different from standard printer stock. It was heavy parchment watermarked with the official seal of a highly specialized estate firm. I recognized the letterhead immediately. It belonged to Bradley, a ruthless corporate trust attorney who Sarah had occasionally consulted during her years managing a successful auto parts supply chain. I had always assumed their relationship was strictly business. I was entirely wrong. I flipped open the thick, protective cover sheet. The bold, capitalized letters at the top of the first page dictated the absolute parameters of my new reality. It was a declaration of irrevocable trust. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. I had spent 30 years working as a logistics manager, negotiating shipping contracts, so reading complex binding agreements was practically second nature to me. Sarah knew this. She knew I would understand the precise mechanical function of the trap she had built. The document was executed and fully notarized exactly 3 weeks before she suffered her final stroke. She had quietly transferred the entirety of her personal estate out of our joint names and placed it directly into this impenetrable legal fortress. She listed the primary residential property. She listed the high-yield investment portfolios. And on the third page, standing out with absolute clarity, she explicitly listed the 1969 Mustang Mach 1 down to the exact vehicle identification number. She named me as the sole living beneficiary and Bradley as the uncompromising executor. But the true genius of the document, the lethal strike that my wife had engineered from her deathbed, was buried in Section 4. I ran my finger down the heavy paper, tracing the ink of a highly specific exclusionary clause. It explicitly stated that no secondary legal instrument, including any general or medical power of attorney, signed by me in the future, could ever authorize the sale, transfer, or liquidation of the assets held within this trust. It was an absolute legal firewall. Sarah had predicted the exact avenue of attack my son would use. She knew that as my health declined, Matthew would attempt to seize control through a power of attorney. She had built a reinforced steel door and welded it shut from the inside. The document I had signed in the hospital while hooked up to heart monitors was completely null and void regarding the car. Matthew had walked into the dealership carrying a piece of paper that possessed zero legal authority. The full weight of the situation slammed into my chest. This was no longer a bitter family dispute over borrowed property. This was no longer a civil matter that could be resolved over a tense dinner conversation. The moment Matthew signed that fraudulent title transfer and handed the keys to the dealership owner, he crossed a catastrophic boundary. Because the power of attorney was void, he had stolen a vehicle valued at nearly $100,000. In the eyes of the law, my son had committed felony grand theft auto. He had stolen property that belonged to a federally protected trust. But the chain of consequences did not stop there. I thought about the massive luxury suitcases blocking my hallway. I thought about the first-class tickets to Dubai and the confident smirk on my son's face as he drank my coffee. He had admitted to selling the car for immediate cash to fund that trip. To complete that transaction, the vintage automotive broker would have wired the massive sum of money directly into Matthew's personal bank account. Using an electronic banking system to receive funds from the sale of stolen property across state lines elevated the crime to a completely different echelon. He had committed federal wire fraud. He had left a permanent, undeniable digital footprint of his crime. I stood alone in the brightly lit commercial garage holding the heavy stack of papers. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background. My hands were no longer shaking. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. I was holding the absolute destruction of my son's life in the palm of my hand. If I walked out of this building and handed this envelope to a police detective, Matthew would not just miss his vacation. He would face decades in a federal penitentiary. His arrogant wife would be stripped of her stolen wealth and publicly humiliated. They had treated me like a disposable resource, a weak-old man who would simply roll over and accept their cruelty. They had severely underestimated the woman who raised him, and they had completely misjudged the man holding the evidence. The trap was set perfectly, but I realized I had to manage the detonation carefully. If I called the authorities right now, they would flag Matthew at the airport before he boarded the plane. He would be arrested on American soil. He would immediately hire a defense attorney and begin draining whatever funds he had left to fight the charges. He might even find a way to access the wired money and transfer it to an offshore account before the police could freeze his assets. I could not let that happen. I needed him to believe he had won. I needed him to be completely isolated, stripped of his power, and entirely dependent on the stolen resources that I was about to rip away from him. I needed him to get on that plane. I carefully folded the irrevocable trust document and slipped it back into the fireproof bag along with Sarah's leather journal. I turned to face the dealership owner, my mind already calculating the first devastating move of my silent adjustment. I stood perfectly still in the brilliantly lit detailing bay. The heavy fireproof envelope rested securely in my hands. The physical evidence of my son committing multiple federal crimes was an incredible weapon. But a weapon is useless if fired at the wrong time. I closed my eyes and visualized the current timeline. Matthew and Amanda were likely arriving at the International Departure Terminal right now. They were probably handing over their massive luxury suitcases to the skycap and walking toward the first-class security lane. My thumb hovered over the emergency call button on my cellular phone. The overwhelming urge to see my son dragged out of the airport in handcuffs was a powerful temptation. But my decades of managing logistics and supply chains taught me to look past the immediate gratification and calculate the long-term variables. If I dialed the police right this second, a cascade of uncontrollable bureaucratic events would begin. Local officers would take my statement. Detectives would need to review the trust documents. Warrants would eventually be drafted. But the legal system was notoriously slow, and my son was incredibly fast. If the authorities contacted Matthew before that Emirates flight left the tarmac, the entire dynamic of my revenge would instantly collapse. Matthew would realize the power of attorney was useless. He would not panic like a cornered animal. He would adapt. While sitting in the airport lounge, he would use his smartphone to immediately wire the massive sum of stolen cash from his personal bank account into an untraceable offshore ledger. He would then cancel the Dubai trip and use whatever funds remained to hire the most aggressive criminal defense attorney in the city. His lawyer would spin the entire situation as a simple familial misunderstanding over complex estate planning. My son would claim I was suffering from cognitive decline after my heart attack. The stolen money would vanish forever. The classic car would be seized as evidence and tied up in a miserable civil litigation battle for years. Worst of all, Matthew would remain free walking the streets while I spent my remaining years fighting him in court. I could not allow that to happen. The only way to execute this strike effectively was to utilize the single greatest advantage I currently possessed. Total silence. Matthew firmly believed he had committed the perfect crime against a weak and unsuspecting old man. He felt completely invincible. I needed to weaponize his arrogance. I needed to wait until that massive commercial airliner was cruising at 30,000 feet over the cold, dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Once the cabin doors were sealed and the aircraft entered international airspace, my son would be disconnected from the world. He would have no cellular service to move his money and no ability to hire legal counsel. He would be trapped in a flying metal tube, utterly helpless, while I dismantled his entire life on the ground. But before I could spring the trap, I had an immediate logistical problem to solve. The car was still incredibly vulnerable. The high-end private auction was scheduled for tomorrow morning. I turned my attention back to the dealership owner. Leon was standing quietly near the workbench, respectfully waiting for my instructions. I knew I could not simply take the keys and drive the vehicle home today. Breaking the fraudulent sales contract Matthew had signed would require official police intervention, and that would immediately alert my son. I needed to secure the asset without making a sound. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out my personal checkbook. It was tied to a private retirement account Sarah had set up for me years ago, completely isolated from the compromised estate funds. I walked over to Leon and looked him directly in the eyes. I kept my voice entirely level and devoid of any panic. I informed him that the title transfer my son executed earlier that morning was a complete fabrication. I told him I possessed the binding legal documents to prove the vehicle was legally locked in a protected trust. I did not ask for a favor. I made a business proposition. I asked Leon to completely halt the auction process and quietly move the car into the most secure climate-controlled storage bay on his property. I offered to write a check right then and there to cover any lost auction fees, any penalties from angry buyers, and the cost of premium secured storage for the next 2 weeks. Leon looked at the fireproof envelope in my hands. He looked back at the classic car resting under the bright lights. He understood the immense gravity of the situation without needing the specific details. He nodded his head and accepted my terms. The car was safe. The silence was maintained. The first phase of my adjustment was officially complete. Now it was time to visit a lawyer and build a cage for my son. I placed my personal checkbook flat on the stainless steel workbench right next to the heavy fireproof envelope. This specific checking account was tied directly to a private retirement fund I had established decades ago. It was completely isolated from the primary estate and entirely invisible to the fraudulent power of attorney my son currently possessed. Matthew thought he had drained my financial leverage, but he was completely mistaken. I clicked my pen and looked directly at the dealership owner. I needed absolute cooperation, and I was willing to purchase it at a premium. I told Leon that I needed him to permanently cancel the scheduled auction. I instructed him to immediately transport the car from the accessible detailing bay into the most secure, restricted storage facility on his property. I offered him a sum of money that vastly exceeded whatever commission he stood to make from the fraudulent sale. I explained that this payment would cover his lost revenue, the inconvenience of canceling the auction, and the guarantee of his total silence for the next 2 weeks. Leon did not immediately accept the offer. He was a legitimate businessman who operated a highly respected establishment, and he needed absolute assurance that he was not becoming an accessory to a crime. He respectfully asked to see the legal proof I had mentioned. He needed to know that I possessed the true legal authority to halt a transaction that had already been processed through his accounting department. I reached into the silver bag and extracted the thick stack of watermarked parchment. I did not show him the leather journal containing the heartbreaking evidence of my son stealing from his family. I only showed him the ironclad legal weapon. I opened the irrevocable trust document to the 3rd page and pointed directly to the specific, exclusionary clause my wife had engineered. Leon leaned over the workbench and read the dense legal text. His eyes scanned the exact vehicle identification number matching the classic muscle car sitting mere feet away from us. He read the stringent parameters stating that no secondary legal instrument could ever override the authority of this trust. As a man who dealt with high-value asset transfers, Leon recognized the airtight nature of the document instantly. The heavy parchment was fully notarized legally, binding and completely devastating to the fake title my son had provided. Leon slowly straightened his posture and handed the document back to me. He let out a long breath and shook his head. He realized the incredible magnitude of the felony my son had committed inside his office just a few hours prior. He stated clearly that he wanted absolutely no part in fencing stolen property for a criminal. He accepted my terms without any further negotiation. I wrote out the substantial check and handed it across the table. Leon folded the paper and slipped it into his apron pocket. He walked over to the wall-mounted intercom system and paged his 2 most trusted senior technicians. When the mechanics arrived, Leon gave them strict, explicit orders. He told them to drop whatever projects they were currently handling and prepare the secure warehouse vault at the back of the property. He commanded them to carefully push the classic vehicle by hand to avoid drawing any unnecessary attention. I stood back and watched the immediate execution of my first defensive maneuver. The 2 technicians placed their hands on the polished chrome bumpers and slowly rolled the heavy candy apple red machine out of the brightly lit detailing bay. I followed them, walking alongside the car my wife had spent 20 years perfecting. We arrived at a massive steel-reinforced door located at the very rear of the industrial building. The technicians rolled the car inside the dark, cavernous space. Leon flipped a heavy switch on the wall. The interior of the vault illuminated, revealing a climate-controlled environment designed specifically to protect million-dollar investments. The mechanics secured the vehicle, placed blocks behind the tires, and draped a heavy, opaque cover over the pristine paint job. They quietly exited the vault and returned to their stations. Leon stepped out of the room and grabbed the heavy steel handle of the warehouse door. He looked at me one last time before pulling it shut. The massive metal door closed with a resounding and permanent thud. I listened to the heavy deadbolts sliding into place. The physical locking of that door represented the absolute turning point in my war against my son. My immediate logistical problem was entirely solved. I thanked Leon for his absolute professionalism and walked out of the dealership into the fading afternoon sunlight. The classic car was safe. The next conflict was building the legal cage that would trap my son the moment his plane touched down in the desert. I left the industrial district behind and steered my sedan toward the towering glass structures of the downtown financial center. The afternoon traffic had thickened, but I barely registered the sea of brake lights. My mind was entirely consumed by the logistics of the impending strike. I navigated into the subterranean parking garage of a towering high-rise and took the express elevator to the 42nd floor. The polished chrome doors slid open to reveal the immaculate reception area of the corporate law firm my wife had trusted with her final wishes. The environment was designed to intimidate. The floors were imported marble, and the walls were lined with dark, rich wood paneling. I did not pause to admire the expensive decor. I walked directly past the receptionist without offering my name. I knew exactly where I was going. I pushed open the heavy solid oak door leading into the corner office. Bradley was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing a digital tablet. He was not a warm family lawyer who handed out hard candies and offered sympathetic smiles. He was a high-powered corporate trust attorney, known for destroying hostile corporate takeovers and shredding opposing legal counsel in civil court. He was exactly the kind of ruthless predator my wife knew I would need when the time came to fight my own blood. He looked up from his screen, clearly annoyed by the sudden, unannounced intrusion. His expression immediately softened into a mask of sharp, professional curiosity when he recognized my face. I did not sit down in the plush leather guest chair. I did not offer a handshake or engage in any polite small talk about the weather or my recent health scare. I walked straight up to the edge of his expansive desk. I raised my hand and dropped the heavy silver fireproof envelope directly onto the polished wood surface. The dense package landed with a heavy, authoritative thud that seemed to echo in the quiet room. I looked Bradley directly in the eyes and told him that Sarah's contingency plan had officially been activated. Bradley did not ask any questions. He leaned forward and carefully slid the thick envelope toward him. He reached inside and extracted the thick stack of watermarked parchment containing the irrevocable trust and the worn leather journal. He placed the notebook to the side for a moment and focused entirely on the legal document. I watched his eyes track back and forth across the dense paragraphs. I watched the slight furrow form on his brow as he reviewed the specific exclusionary clauses my wife had engineered. He flipped to the signature page and verified the official notary seals. When he finished the primary document, he picked up the small leather journal. I instructed him to read the final 3 entries. The silence in the corner office was absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the central air conditioning and the sharp rustle of thick paper turning. I stood motionless like a soldier waiting for a commanding officer to confirm the target coordinates. I watched the blood drain slightly from the attorney's face as he read my wife's meticulous documentation of our son's financial depravity. He read the attached pawn shop receipts and the forged bank withdrawal slips. He read the final entry detailing the fraudulent credit cards opened in my name. When he finally closed the leather cover, he took a slow, measured breath. He removed his expensive reading glasses and rested his elbows heavily on the desk. Bradley looked at me with a completely new level of respect. He stated that in his 30 years of practicing corporate law, he had rarely seen a trap engineered with such devastating perfection. I asked him to clarify the exact legal standing of my son's actions from earlier that morning. Bradley did not mince his words. He switched into a clinical, highly aggressive legal mode. He informed me that the general power of attorney I had signed in the hospital was completely neutralized by the specific clauses in Sarah's trust. The document Matthew had presented to the vintage automotive broker was legally classified as a fraudulent instrument. He leaned back in his leather chair and began listing the charges as if reading from a criminal indictment. Because the vehicle was protected by a federally recognized trust, Matthew had committed grand theft. Because the value of the classic muscle car vastly exceeded the state felony threshold, it was a first-degree offense. Bradley continued explaining that because the dealership owner had undoubtedly wired the massive sum of cash directly into my son's personal bank account, the crime had automatically crossed into the jurisdiction of federal wire fraud. He confirmed with absolute certainty that my son was currently sitting on a commercial airliner, having successfully committed multiple high-level felonies that carried mandatory prison sentences. I felt a tight knot of lingering anxiety completely dissolve in my chest. The dealership owner had confirmed the physical security of the vehicle, and now one of the most ruthless attorneys in the city had just confirmed the absolute legality of my revenge. Matthew had walked directly into the center of the minefield, and Sarah had given me the detonator. I placed both of my hands flat on the edge of the mahogany desk and leaned forward. I told Bradley that I did not just want to file a police report. I wanted to completely obliterate my son's financial existence before his plane landed. Bradley offered a cold, razor-sharp smile. He picked up his desk phone and pressed a single button to summon his entire paralegal team. The legal strike was no longer a plan. It was an active execution. The heavy oak door swung open. 3 paralegals marched into the corner office carrying sleek silver laptops. Bradley did not ask them to sit. He stood behind his mahogany desk and began issuing rapid-fire commands. He transformed instantly from a corporate lawyer into a military commander coordinating a surgical airstrike. I sat in the plush leather guest chair and watched the absolute destruction of my son begin. The first target was the fraudulent power of attorney. Bradley dictated a formal revocation order to his lead assistant. He cited the specific exclusionary clauses from Sarah's irrevocable trust. He mandated that the revocation be marked urgent and effective, immediately, retroactively, neutralizing any transaction initiated in the past 48 hours. Within minutes, the assistant generated a legally binding document that completely stripped Matthew of any authority over my life. Bradley slid the heavy parchment across the desk. I picked up a solid gold pen and signed my name. The dark ink flowing onto the paper felt incredibly permanent. The assistant immediately scanned the signed revocation and blasted it through secure digital channels to every major financial institution in the state. She sent certified legal notices to the county clerk and the local authorities. Matthew was officially cut off from my medical and legal identity. His golden ticket was now nothing more than a worthless piece of paper. But removing his future access was not enough. We needed to neutralize the resources he currently possessed. Bradley turned his attention to the joint bank accounts. These were the accounts I had naively allowed Matthew to access years ago to help manage my household bills. This was the exact destination where the vintage automotive broker had wired the massive sum of cash for my wife's stolen car. Bradley dialed the direct emergency line for the executive fraud department of the National Bank. He bypassed the standard customer service representatives and demanded to speak directly with a senior fraud investigator. When the investigator answered, Bradley did not make a polite request. He aggressively declared that a massive felony wire fraud had just occurred. He provided my social security number and the exact routing details of the joint account. He informed the bank that the recent massive wire transfer was the direct result of a stolen vehicle transaction, bypassing a federally protected trust. The investigator hesitated for only a fraction of a second before the immense legal liability forced him to act. Banks do not take risks when federal wire fraud is formally alleged by a major corporate law firm. I listened through the speakerphone as the rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard echoed in the corner office. The investigator spoke in a clipped professional tone. He confirmed that the entire balance of the joint account was now completely locked. The funds were frozen pending a full federal investigation. Matthew could not withdraw a single dollar. He could not transfer the stolen money to a different institution. The massive payday he thought he had cleverly secured for his luxury vacation was now trapped in a secure digital vault that he could never open. His entire safety cushion was obliterated in less than 10 minutes. The financial guillotine continued to fall without mercy. Bradley moved on to the third phase of the execution. We targeted the high-limit premium credit cards Matthew had fraudulently opened using my identity. These were the exact luxury travel and lifestyle cards he was undoubtedly planning to use at the opulent resorts in the Middle East. These were the cards my wife had secretly paid off to protect my failing heart. Bradley contacted the elite fraud divisions of 3 separate major credit bureaus. He reported the accounts as extreme cases of familial identity theft and financial elder abuse. He initiated a total catastrophic credit lockdown. The accounts were instantly closed and permanently red-flagged across all international networks. Any attempt to swipe those specific plastic cards would result in an immediate automatic decline. Furthermore, it would trigger a silent alert to international authorities indicating that a fugitive was attempting to utilize compromised funds. I watched the paralegals systematically cross off items on a large whiteboard. Every red line drawn across that white surface represented another door slamming shut in my son's face. I sat back in my chair and took a deep, steady breath. The sheer speed of the operation was staggering. In less than 2 hours, a team of strangers in sharp suits had completely dismantled the entire financial empire my son had built on top of my ruined family. I thought about all the times Matthew had come to me asking for money. I remembered him sitting at my kitchen table years ago, complaining about how hard it was to make a living and support his new wife. I had always opened my wallet. I had always written the check. I had spent my entire life trying to provide a soft safety net for my only child. Now I was actively burning that net to ashes. But I did not feel any guilt. I did not feel the crushing weight of a father failing his son. I felt the absolute clarity of a victim finally standing up to his abuser. Matthew had mistaken my paternal love for blind stupidity. He believed that because I was old and grieving, I would simply roll over and accept his absolute cruelty. He had used my own medical emergency as a weapon against me. He had allowed his arrogant wife to stand in my kitchen and demand I throw away the last remaining memories of the woman who brought him into this world. Sarah had warned me in her hidden journal that my forgiveness was a fatal flaw. She was right. But today, that flaw was completely eradicated. Bradley dismissed the paralegal team. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving just the 2 of us in the quiet office. Bradley leaned back in his expensive chair and took a slow sip of water from a crystal glass. He looked directly at me and confirmed that the financial lockdown was entirely complete. The trap was fully armed. Matthew possessed zero access to my estate. He possessed zero access to his own bank accounts containing the stolen car funds. He possessed zero access to the fraudulent premium credit lines. His expensive designer wallet was now just a useless collection of expired plastic and permanently blocked access codes. The execution of the silent adjustment had been flawless. We had successfully built a perfect invisible cage. The only thing left to do was wait for my son to land inside it. I returned to the profound silence of my home. The sun had fully set beneath the horizon, casting long, heavy shadows across the hardwood floors of the hallway. I walked past the exact spot where my son's massive luxury suitcases had rested just a few hours earlier. I did not turn on the television or bother to prepare an evening meal. The adrenaline pumping through my veins provided all the sustenance I required. I walked directly into my quiet home office and sat behind my heavy oak desk. I opened my laptop and loaded a global commercial aviation tracking website. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard as I typed in the specific Emirates flight number my son had so arrogantly paraded in front of me. The screen refreshed instantly. A tiny green airplane icon appeared hovering over the eastern seaboard of the United States. They had departed the gate exactly on schedule. I sat alone in the darkness, illuminated entirely by the cold blue glow of the computer monitor. I watched that tiny pixelated aircraft inch its way slowly across the digital map. Every single millimeter it moved eastward represented another physical mile of distance between my son and the stolen financial empire he thought he had secured. I visualized Matthew and his entitled wife sitting inside their exclusive first-class cabin. They were undoubtedly reclining in their private leather seats, sipping complimentary vintage champagne and toasting to their own perceived brilliance. They firmly believed they had executed the perfect, flawless crime against a weak old man. They thought they had successfully converted my dead wife's relentless dedication into a lavish tropical vacation. They possessed absolutely no idea that their premium credit cards were currently turning into useless pieces of melted plastic while they celebrated their victory. I required absolute mathematical certainty before I initiated the final destructive phase of my plan. I could not risk a sudden medical emergency on board or a mechanical failure forcing the pilots to turn the aircraft around and land prematurely on American soil. I had to wait patiently until they passed the definitive point of no return. I sat perfectly motionless in my leather desk chair for 3 agonizingly slow hours. I watched the green icon leave the safety of the continental United States and drift out over the vast, terrifyingly dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. I waited until the live flight telemetry indicated they were cruising at 35,000 feet, directly midway between 2 massive continents. They were completely surrounded by thousands of miles of freezing water and thin air. They possessed absolutely zero cellular service and no ability to contact their frozen bank accounts or hire emergency legal representation. They were floating through the night sky inside a luxurious aluminum cage, completely deaf and blind to the catastrophic legal firestorm I was actively fueling on the ground. The timing was finally perfect. I reached across the desk, picked up my cell phone, and dialed the direct emergency line for my corporate attorney. Bradley answered the phone on the very first ring. I did not bother with a polite greeting or ask about his evening. I simply stared at the blinking green icon on my computer screen and told him to release the hounds. Bradley confirmed the instruction with cold, ruthless, professional efficiency. He informed me that his senior legal team had remained standing by at the county courthouse, waiting for my explicit authorization. He officially submitted the comprehensive criminal complaint directly to the on-call district attorney. His team presented the sworn affidavits, the certified irrevocable trust documents, and the undeniable digital proof of the fraudulent wire transfer connecting my son to the stolen funds. Bradley stayed on the secure line to narrate the rapid bureaucratic destruction of my son's freedom. He explained that the district attorney recognized the extreme severity of the multiple federal crimes immediately. The prosecutor also recognized the undeniable high flight risk demonstrated by the international travel destination. A state judge was awakened to review the ironclad evidence my wife had so meticulously prepared. The judge immediately signed the emergency arrest warrants without a single moment of hesitation. My son was no longer just a greedy, ungrateful child who had stolen from his grieving family. Matthew was now officially classified by the government as a federal fugitive wanted for first-degree grand theft auto and international wire fraud. The legal machinery moved with terrifying speed. His name, his passport number, and his physical description were instantly uploaded into the global criminal databases. When that massive commercial airliner finally touched down in the United Arab Emirates, the local border control authorities would be fully aware of his active fugitive status. I thanked Bradley for his flawless tactical execution and ended the phone call. I leaned back heavily in my office chair and stared at the glowing flight tracker one last time. The invisible trap had violently snapped shut. There was no possible avenue of escape. Matthew had willingly traded his family, his freedom, and his entire future for a single luxury plane ticket. Now he was flying completely blind toward a brick wall, and I was the man who had laid the mortar. I slowly closed the lid of my laptop, plunging the home office into total darkness. The glowing green icon disappeared, but the reality of my actions remained entirely solid. I had just initiated a sequence of events that would completely destroy my only child. Society often dictates that a parent must offer unconditional forgiveness, regardless of the pain inflicted upon them. Society demands that blood must always remain thicker than water. But as I sat in the quiet, dark room, I realized that blood can also be toxic. Blood can harbor a parasite that slowly drains you until there is nothing left but an empty shell. I refused to be that shell. I refused to let my wife's memory be pawned off to fund the arrogance of a boy who had lost his soul years ago. I stood up from my desk, feeling a profound sense of closure regarding the legal battle. The offensive strike was entirely complete. Now I needed to focus on the physical sanctuary of my home before the inevitable fallout reached my front door. The morning sun pierced through the living room windows, casting sharp geometric shapes across the floorboards. I had not slept a single hour. My body was exhausted, but my mind was completely wired with the cold, calculating energy of a man preparing for a siege. The legal and financial traps were perfectly set and currently hurtling through international airspace. However, my physical sanctuary was still fundamentally compromised. Matthew possessed a heavy brass key to the front door. He knew the access code to the side garage entry. For years, I had willingly given him unrestricted access to my home, believing he was my family. Now I knew he was simply a thief waiting for another opportunity to strike. I could not allow him or anyone he might contact to step foot on my property ever again. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for a premium private security firm I had researched during the early hours of the morning. I did not want a standard alarm system that simply made a loud noise. I wanted an impenetrable fortress. I explained my situation to the dispatcher, utilizing a tone that brokered absolutely no negotiation. I requested their elite rapid response installation team and offered to pay triple their standard emergency rate to have them at my house within the hour. Money was no longer an object of preservation. It was a tool of absolute defense. Within 45 minutes, 2 heavy commercial vans pulled into my driveway. 4 technicians wearing crisp, tactical uniforms stepped out carrying heavy equipment cases. I met them at the front door and gave them a single sweeping directive. I told them to completely sever my home from its past. The lead technician nodded, and his team immediately went to work. The peaceful quiet of my suburban neighborhood was quickly replaced by the aggressive whine of power drills and the heavy thud of metal components locking into place. I watched as they systematically removed every single original brass deadbolt from the exterior doors. They replaced them with heavy-duty biometric locks, reinforced by solid steel strike plates embedded deep into the wall frames. The old garage keypad was completely dismantled and replaced with a modern encrypted scanner. They mounted high-definition night vision cameras at every possible angle covering the driveway, the backyard, and the side street. Every window on the ground floor was retrofitted with shatter-proof security film and sensitive glass break sensors. They ran miles of hidden wiring through the attic, connecting the entire network to a central processing unit, securely hidden inside my master bedroom closet. By early afternoon, the transformation was entirely complete. The lead technician handed me a sleek digital tablet. The screen displayed 8 crystal-clear, high-definition video feeds covering every single inch of my property perimeter. He explained that the system was directly linked to a private armed response center. If anyone attempted to bypass the biometric scanners or tamper with the cameras, a security team would be dispatched immediately, regardless of whether I was home to trigger an alarm. I signed their work order and paid the massive invoice using my secure private account. The heavy vans backed out of my driveway, leaving me entirely alone in my newly fortified sanctuary. I walked through the silent hallways of my house. I tested the heavy reinforced doors. I listened to the satisfying electronic hum of the deadbolts automatically engaging behind me. The environment no longer felt like a vulnerable mausoleum waiting to be picked clean by scavengers. It felt like a command bunker. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. I stood by the window looking out over the manicured lawn. My physical safety was guaranteed. The fortress was sealed. There was absolutely nothing more I could do from this side of the ocean. I glanced up at the digital clock glowing softly on the microwave display. I quickly calculated the massive time zone difference between my quiet American kitchen and the scorching desert of the United Arab Emirates. The commercial airliner carrying my son and his entitled wife was currently initiating its final descent. They were completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality awaiting them on the ground. They were likely freshening up in the first-class lavatory, smoothing their designer clothes, and preparing to step off the plane as conquering royalty. They expected a fleet of luxury town cars and a penthouse suite decorated with fresh flowers. They had no idea that their entire financial empire had been legally vaporized while they slept. I took a slow sip of water and stared at the clock. The silent adjustment was over. The deafening explosion was about to begin. The massive commercial airliner touched down on the sun-baked runway of Dubai International Airport. Matthew stretched his arms above his head in the expansive first-class cabin, feeling completely invincible. He looked out the oval window at the shimmering desert skyline. He turned to his wife Amanda, who was carefully reapplying her expensive lipstick in a gold-plated compact mirror. They had spent the last 14 hours drinking complimentary champagne and laughing about the ease of their incredible heist. They firmly believed they had left all their problems thousands of miles behind them in a dusty suburban garage. Matthew adjusted his tailored jacket, confident that the massive wire transfer was safely resting in his bank account, waiting to fund their lavish lifestyle. They bypassed the crowded customs lines utilizing their premium travel passes. A private chauffeur holding a digital tablet with their last name greeted them at the arrival gate. The chauffeur loaded their massive luxury suitcases into the trunk of a pristine black luxury sedan. As the vehicle glided onto the massive multi-lane highway, Matthew wrapped his arm around Amanda. He bragged about how simple it had been to trick his aging father. He called the old man weak and sentimental, claiming the classic car was completely wasted on someone who rarely left the house. Amanda agreed wholeheartedly, stating that they were simply claiming their rightful inheritance a few years early. They looked at the towering glass skyscrapers surrounding them, completely intoxicated by their stolen wealth. The sedan pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of one of the most exclusive resorts in the United Arab Emirates. The architecture was a stunning display of limitless wealth, featuring soaring arches and cascading water features that defied the brutal desert heat. A team of uniformed bellhops immediately swarmed the vehicle, opening the doors and carefully extracting their heavy luggage. Matthew stepped out into the dry, oppressive heat, but he barely felt the temperature. He felt only the intoxicating rush of absolute power. He handed a careless cash tip to the driver and took Amanda by the arm. They walked through the towering glass double doors into a lobby that looked like a royal palace. The floors were cut from seamless Italian marble, and massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the wealthy elite milling about. Matthew and Amanda bypassed the standard check-in line and walked directly toward the exclusive concierge desk. They moved with the arrogant swagger of royalty, demanding immediate tribute. A perfectly groomed receptionist wearing a tailored suit offered a warm professional smile as they approached. Matthew did not return the greeting. He simply slapped his premium solid metal credit card onto the polished marble counter. He demanded the keys to the panoramic penthouse suite he had reserved months ago. He instructed the receptionist to ensure that a chilled bottle of their most expensive vintage champagne was sent up immediately. Amanda leaned against the counter, tapping her manicured nails impatiently against the stone surface. They stood at the pinnacle of their perceived success. They were surrounded by extreme luxury, entirely funded by a lifetime of someone else's hard work. Matthew looked around the opulent lobby, already planning which exclusive boutiques they would raid after they settled into their room. He imagined the envious comments their friends would leave on their social media photos. He felt a profound sense of superiority, believing he had outsmarted his father, the legal system, and the entire concept of consequences. The receptionist picked up the heavy metal credit card and slid the magnetic strip through the secure digital terminal. Matthew smiled at his wife, completely unprepared for the invisible guillotine that was about to fall on his neck. The polished marble counter felt cool beneath Matthew's hands as he waited for the transaction to process. The impeccably dressed receptionist slid the heavy solid metal credit card through the secure digital terminal. Instead of the satisfying chime of approval, the machine emitted a sharp, flat electronic buzz. The small digital screen flashed a bright red error message. The receptionist maintained her flawless, professional smile. She politely slid the card back across the marble surface and softly informed Matthew that the issuing bank had declined the authorization. Matthew rolled his eyes in exaggerated annoyance. He confidently told Amanda that it was simply a standard security measure. He explained that his private bank was overly protective and must have placed an automatic travel block on the account because they were in a foreign country. He reached into his designer leather wallet, completely unbothered by the minor delay. He pulled out a second card. This was the premium high-limit lifestyle card he had fraudulently opened using my social security number. He flipped it onto the counter with a heavy sigh, acting as if the resort system was the problem. The receptionist picked it up and inserted the smart chip into the terminal. She waited for the network to communicate across the globe. 10 seconds passed in absolute silence. The machine buzzed again, louder this time. The red light flashed twice. The receptionist looked at the screen, and her professional smile faltered slightly. She lowered her voice to a discreet whisper, attempting to save him from public embarrassment. She stated that this card was also completely blocked, and the terminal was instructing her to retain the plastic. Matthew snatched the card back before she could confiscate it. A cold bead of sweat formed at the base of his neck. The air conditioning in the opulent lobby suddenly felt entirely inadequate. Amanda let out a loud, dramatic sigh. She shifted her weight from one expensive stiletto to the other and complained about the service. She loudly demanded to know why it was taking so long to get the keys to their penthouse. Her voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings, drawing the attention of several wealthy guests standing nearby. The humiliation was beginning to take root. Matthew felt the sting of their judgmental stares. He was a man who defined his entire worth by his financial appearance, and his facade was rapidly cracking in front of an international audience. He told Amanda to lower her voice with a sharp hiss of genuine panic. He opened his wallet for the third time. His hands were visibly shaking. He bypassed the credit cards and pulled out the primary debit card tied directly to our joint banking account. This was the absolute safety net. This was the exact digital vault where the vintage automotive broker had wired the massive sum of cash for the stolen classic car just 24 hours ago. There was absolutely no reason for this card to fail. It contained enough stolen capital to buy the luxury suite outright for a month. He handed the plastic to the receptionist. His arrogant swagger was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading look. The receptionist swiped the debit card. The terminal did not even pause to process the request. It immediately locked the screen and began printing a small paper receipt. The receptionist tore the slip from the machine and looked at it with wide eyes. She did not slide the debit card back across the counter. She placed it securely in a locked drawer beneath her station. She looked directly at Matthew and stated clearly that her system had just flagged the account for severe fraudulent activity. She informed him that the international banking network had ordered the immediate confiscation of the card. She then politely but firmly asked him to step aside so she could assist the actual paying guests waiting in line behind him. The public rejection was absolute. The wealthy patrons in the lobby stopped whispering and simply stared openly at the couple who could not afford to pay for their room. Amanda stood frozen in shock, her mouth slightly open, as the reality of the situation crashed over her. Matthew grabbed her arm and practically dragged her away from the reception desk toward a quiet corner of the massive lobby. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. He dropped his expensive carry-on bag onto the floor. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket. His thumb frantically tapped the screen to open his primary mobile banking application. He needed to see the massive balance from the car sale to prove to himself that this was all just a massive technological glitch. The loading icon spun in a continuous loop for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the screen refreshed. Matthew stopped breathing entirely. There was no massive balance waiting for him. There was no safety net. The available funds section displayed a bold, unforgiving 0. Stretching across the entire top half of his phone screen was a glaring bright red banner. The capitalized white letters inside the banner read "Frozen Pending Federal Fraud Investigation." The walls of the opulent desert palace seemed to close in around him. The stolen money was completely gone. His credit lines were utterly destroyed. He was standing thousands of miles away from home with no physical cash, no access to his accounts, and a furious wife demanding answers. He had flown halfway across the world to celebrate his absolute victory over my life. Instead, he had willingly walked into an inescapable financial prison. The foundation of his arrogant reality shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Matthew stood trapped in the corner of the opulent lobby. The towering marble pillars surrounding him no longer looked like magnificent symbols of his absolute success. They felt like the solid, heavy bars of a golden cage. Amanda paced furiously back and forth in front of him. Her expensive designer heels clicked aggressively against the polished stone floor. She hissed at him to do something immediately. She demanded to know why they were being treated like common street criminals by the hotel hospitality staff. Matthew could not provide a rational answer. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. He stared relentlessly at the bright red fraud alert glowing on his phone screen. His brain desperately tried to rationalize the catastrophic failure of his perfect criminal plan. He convinced himself it was simply a massive automated banking error. He assumed a mindless computer algorithm had incorrectly flagged the massive international transaction. He firmly believed a single aggressive phone call to his father could resolve the entire humiliating nightmare. Matthew navigated to his contacts list and dialed my number. His thumb pressed the glass screen with frantic, excessive force. He pressed the phone tight to his ear and listened to the hollow electronic tone of the international connection ringing. He paced in a tight, anxious circle. He deliberately ignored the wealthy international guests who were still staring openly at their public disgrace. He rapidly rehearsed the specific lies he was going to tell me. He planned to act deeply annoyed rather than terrified. He planned to blame my supposed technological incompetence for the banking freeze. He still firmly believed I was the weak, grieving old man he had callously left behind in the kitchen. He still thought he held the invincible power of attorney and maintained absolute control over my entire life. Halfway across the world, I sat completely still in the profound silence of my living room. The heavy reinforced electronic door locks hummed softly in the background. The newly installed security cameras constantly monitored the perimeter of my impenetrable fortress. The house was completely dark except for a single warm reading lamp illuminating the heavy leather chair where I sat. I had the heavy silver fireproof envelope resting securely on the side table right next to me. My cell phone rested quietly on my lap. I had been waiting for this exact moment for several long hours. When the screen finally illuminated brightly with an incoming international video and audio call, I did not rush to answer it. I simply watched my son's name flash repeatedly across the digital display. I let the phone ring 3 full times. I wanted him to feel the heavy, agonizing weight of those passing seconds. I wanted his internal panic to ripen fully before I picked up the receiver. I pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear. I did not offer a polite greeting or ask how his flight went. I simply listened to the chaotic background noise of the lavish Dubai lobby. Matthew did not waste a single second on pleasantries either. He immediately launched into a hysterical, furious tirade. His voice echoed through the speaker with a pathetic mixture of profound rage and sheer escalating terror. He screamed my name loudly. He demanded to know what on earth I had done to the joint banking accounts. He ordered me to call the National Bank branch immediately and explicitly authorized the immediate release of his frozen funds. He spoke to me as if I were a disobedient servant who had made a massive clerical error. He threatened to have me permanently placed in a restrictive assisted living facility the very moment he returned home if I did not fix the problem right, that exact second. I listened quietly to his frantic, empty threats. A year ago, his loud, aggressive screaming would have instantly spiked my blood pressure and sent me rushing to appease him. I would have profusely apologized for the inconvenience and desperately tried to smooth over his volatile anger. But the man sitting in the dark leather chair was entirely different now. His screaming sounded incredibly weak to my ears. It sounded exactly like a spoiled child throwing a violent physical tantrum because a favorite toy was suddenly taken away. I did not interrupt him. I let him expend his remaining emotional energy, yelling pointlessly into the international phone line. I let him list all the terrible financial and legal things he planned to do to my life. When he finally ran entirely out of breath and demanded an immediate answer, the silence on the line grew heavy, cold, and suffocating. Matthew frantically demanded to know if I was still there. He loudly asked if I was listening to him. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the absolute primal panic hiding underneath his arrogant, wealthy facade. Amanda yelled something piercing and shrill in the background, demanding that I wire them physical cash immediately so they could finally check into their luxury penthouse suite. They were both entirely and completely oblivious to the massive, terrifying gravity of their situation. They thought they were facing a temporary, annoying travel inconvenience. They had absolutely no idea they were actively speaking to the architect of their total destruction. I took a slow, measured breath. The air in my fortified home was cool and perfectly still. I kept my voice incredibly low, steady, and entirely devoid of any sympathetic emotion. I did not match his frantic screaming. I did not sound angry, bitter, or vindictive. I sounded exactly like a judge delivering a final, unalterable sentence. I told Matthew that I had not made a mistake. I informed him that I was the one who personally contacted the executive fraud department of the National Bank branch. I stated clearly, and without hesitation, that I was the one who legally ordered the complete lockdown of the joint accounts and the permanent cancellation of every single premium credit card in his designer wallet. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and terrifying. The chaotic background noise of the wealthy Dubai lobby seemed to fade away completely into nothingness. I could hear Matthew breathing heavily and erratically into the receiver. His arrogant brain was violently struggling to process the impossible information I had just delivered. The concept of me finally standing up to him was so entirely alien to his established reality that it simply did not compute. He stammered slightly over his next words. He aggressively asked me what I was talking about. He tried to instantly reclaim his false authority by loudly reminding me about the general power of attorney he possessed. He proudly and aggressively stated that I had absolutely no legal right to freeze his financial assets because he was fully in charge of my entire estate. He clung desperately to that fraudulent legal document like a drowning man holding tightly onto a rapidly sinking anchor. He furiously demanded I reverse the bank order immediately before he called the local police on me. He had just handed me the absolute perfect opening to drop the final devastating truth. I let Matthew finish his frantic rant about his perceived legal authority. His desperate clinging to the power of attorney was almost pathetic to witness through the audio receiver. I sat in the dim, comforting light of my living room and reached for the items resting on the table beside me. I did not raise my voice to match his panic. I simply instructed him to close his mouth and listen very carefully because I was only going to explain his new reality one time. I told him that the piece of paper he forced me to sign while I was hooked up to hospital monitors was completely meaningless. I heard him gasp slightly, preparing to launch into another aggressive argument, but I immediately cut him off. I picked up the small brown leather notebook. I ran my thumb over the worn cover and told my son that his mother had left a final message specifically for him. I opened the journal to the very first page. I spoke clearly into the receiver, making sure every single syllable carried across the ocean with absolute clarity. I read the date from 4 years ago. I read Sarah's exact words detailing the missing $12,000 from our joint savings account. I heard Matthew draw a sharp, ragged breath as I described the forged withdrawal slip he had used to funnel that money into his private offshore gambling ledger. I did not stop there. I turned the page and read the entry about my mother's diamond tennis bracelet. I reminded him of the 2 anxious days we spent searching the house and the fake police report he boldly filed claiming a burglar had slipped through the back door. I read Sarah's meticulous notes matching the date of the pawnshop ticket to the exact week he and Amanda purchased their brand new luxury sport utility vehicle. The silence from the Dubai lobby was absolute. The arrogant, wealthy facade had been completely ripped away, exposing the terrified thief underneath. I told Matthew that his mother knew about every single dime he had stolen over the past decade. She knew about the fraudulent credit cards he opened using my social security number. She knew about the fake business loans he claimed were failing. She had silently absorbed his massive financial sins and documented every single felony to protect my failing heart. I told him that he had spent years treating us like a disposable bank account, thinking he was an invincible criminal mastermind. In reality, he was just a sloppy parasite, and his own mother had spent her final days building a flawless, impenetrable case against him. Matthew finally found his voice. It was barely a whisper. He tried to stammer out a pathetic denial claiming those were just familial misunderstandings, and that he still maintained the legal right to manage the estate. I closed the leather journal and picked up the thick stack of watermarked parchment. I completely shattered his final remaining illusion. I informed him that exactly 3 weeks before her final stroke, his mother had executed a secondary irrevocable trust. I read the specific exclusionary clause directly from the heavy paper. I explained the precise legal mechanics of the trap she had engineered. I told him that the trust explicitly protected the classic muscle car and permanently neutralized any future power of attorney I might ever sign. I waited a few seconds to let the complex legal reality crush the last remaining hope out of his chest. I explained that when he walked into that vintage automotive dealership and signed the title transfer, he was utilizing an entirely fraudulent instrument. I told him that I had already visited the dealership and paid the owner a premium to permanently secure the vehicle in a locked warehouse. The car was perfectly safe, and his bill of sale was entirely void. I laid out the catastrophic chain of consequences with cold, mechanical precision. I stated that stealing a vehicle of that immense value from a federally protected trust constituted first-degree grand theft auto. I further explained that receiving the electronic transfer of those stolen funds into his personal bank account immediately escalated his crime to federal wire fraud. I could hear Amanda crying hysterically in the background. Her shrill voice echoed over the phone line as she finally began to understand that her luxury vacation had just turned into a permanent nightmare. Matthew pleaded with me. He dropped the aggressive tone completely and begged me to call the lawyers to stop the process. He promised to return the money and swore he would never ask for another favor again. I felt absolutely no pity for the man sobbing into the phone. I delivered the final devastating blow. I informed him that there was no legal process left to stop. I told him that my corporate trust attorney had already submitted the comprehensive criminal complaint directly to the district attorney. I stated clearly, and without a single trace of hesitation, that a state judge had already reviewed his mother's meticulous evidence. The judge had recognized the extreme flight risk demonstrated by his lavish trip to the Middle East I told my son that the local authorities had officially issued an international arrest warrant for his immediate capture. His name and his passport number were currently flashing across global law enforcement databases. I explained that he was no longer a wealthy tourist enjoying a first-class holiday. He was a documented federal fugitive entirely stranded in a foreign desert with zero financial resources. I told him that if he attempted to seek help from the American embassy, they would immediately detain him and flag his location for extradition back to the United States. He had willingly walked into an inescapable prison of his own making, and I was the man who had permanently locked the door. The audio coming through the phone receiver shifted violently. I heard a brief physical struggle followed by a sharp gasp from my son. Amanda had snatched the cellular device directly out of his trembling hand. She did not possess the capacity for fear or remorse. Her entire worldview was constructed on a foundation of absolute entitlement, and she reacted to the collapse of her reality with pure, unfiltered rage. She pressed the phone to her mouth and launched into a hysterical, blistering tirade. She screamed that I was a bitter, miserable old man who was completely jealous of their youth and success. She loudly declared that her father was a prominent corporate executive who retained a fleet of vicious civil litigators. She threatened to sue me for severe emotional distress, defamation of character, and unlawful financial interference. She promised to drag me through the court system until I was forced to sell the house and sleep on the streets. She demanded that I immediately transfer $100,000 into her personal digital payment account as compensation for ruining her luxury anniversary vacation. She threatened to call the international press and expose me as an abusive monster who abandoned his only child in a foreign country. Her voice grew increasingly shrill, cutting through the quiet atmosphere of my fortified living room like a rusty blade. She was completely blind to the actual danger surrounding her. She firmly believed that throwing a massive verbal tantrum could magically reverse a federal criminal indictment. She thought she could bully a state judge and intimidate global law enforcement by simply screaming loud enough into a phone. I listened to her unhinged threats with absolute stoic detachment. I did not feel the sudden spike of anxiety that usually accompanied her dramatic outbursts. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, profound exhaustion regarding their existence. I did not attempt to argue with her. I did not bother trying to explain the fundamental difference between an empty civil lawsuit and an active federal felony warrant. You cannot reason with a parasite when you are actively removing it from your skin. I waited for her to pause for a single breath. When she finally gasped for air, I spoke my final sentence to them. I told her to enjoy the desert heat, because it was the closest thing to hell she would experience before the federal authorities brought her husband home in chains. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I did not wait for her inevitable shrieking response. I pressed my thumb firmly against the red digital button on the screen and completely severed the international connection. The chaotic noise of the opulent lobby vanished instantly, replaced by the deep, comforting silence of my secure home. But disconnecting the call was not enough. I opened the security settings within my contact list. I selected my son's phone number and engaged the permanent block feature. I repeated the exact same process for Amanda's cellular device. I erased their digital access to my life with 2 simple taps on a glass screen. They could no longer call, text, or leave desperate voicemails begging for a rescue. The communication bridge was entirely and permanently destroyed. Thousands of miles away in the scorching heat of the United Arab Emirates. The absolute finality of their situation finally materialized. Matthew and Amanda were standing in the middle of a marble lobby, surrounded by extreme wealth they could no longer touch. The receptionist had confiscated their only source of stolen funds. Their premium credit lines were permanently deactivated. They possessed no physical currency to purchase a meal or secure a cheap motel room on the outskirts of the city. Their return flight tickets were inherently tied to the fraudulent credit cards, meaning the airline would automatically cancel their passage home the moment the payment bounced. If they walked out of those heavy glass doors, they would step into a sprawling, foreign metropolis with absolutely no resources. If they attempted to visit the American embassy to beg for an emergency repatriation loan, the consular officers would immediately scan their passports. That scan would instantly trigger the international arrest warrant resting in the global law enforcement database. They would be detained by foreign authorities and held in a temporary holding facility until the extradition paperwork was finalized. They were completely cornered. The luxurious anniversary trip they had funded by stealing my dead wife's legacy had rapidly transformed into an inescapable nightmare. The desert mirage they had so arrogantly chased had completely evaporated, leaving them entirely stranded to face the devastating consequences of their own greed. 7 days passed. For me, those 7 days were spent in profound peace. I drank my morning coffee in my quiet kitchen. I read novels in my secure living room. I tended to my garden without the constant lingering anxiety of my son unexpectedly dropping by to demand money. But for Matthew and Amanda, those same 7 days were an absolute descent into a customized personal hell. My corporate attorney, Bradley, utilized his extensive network of private investigators and international contacts to monitor their exact movements. He provided me with daily, highly detailed updates regarding their rapid public deterioration. The opulent desert resort did not offer them an ounce of sympathy. When the reality of their frozen accounts became undeniable, the hotel management politely but firmly summoned private security. Matthew and Amanda were publicly escorted out of the massive glass doors. They were forced to stand on the scorching concrete driveway, dragging their heavy designer luggage. They did not have enough physical currency to hire a luxury town car. They did not even have enough to hail a standard taxi. They were forced to walk several miles in the oppressive, suffocating heat of the United Arab Emirates just to locate a public transit station. Their pristine silk travel outfits were completely soaked in sweat and coated in fine desert dust by the time they finally retreated to the only place that would accept them without an entry fee. They returned to the international airport. They spent an entire week trapped inside the fluorescent purgatory of the departure terminal. The international banking authorities had officially red-flagged their names, preventing them from accessing any financial institutions. The arrogant couple who had demanded a panoramic penthouse suite and vintage champagne were reduced to fighting for floor space near the public restrooms. Bradley informed me that airport security footage showed them sleeping directly on the cold, hard linoleum tiles. Those massive hard-shell luxury suitcases that had arrogantly blocked my hallway just a week prior were repurposed as incredibly uncomfortable pillows. Amanda was forced to wash her face in the public sinks alongside exhausted budget travelers. The humiliation was absolute and entirely public. Matthew spent those 7 days desperately scrolling through his phone. He utilized the free airport wireless internet to call every single person he considered a friend. He begged his wealthy business associates for an emergency loan. He pleaded with his country club acquaintances. But superficial friendships are entirely built on the illusion of success. The moment Matthew admitted he was completely broke and stranded, his elite social circle vanished. They stopped answering his calls. They ignored his frantic messages. Amanda tried to contact her prominent corporate father, but he had already been briefed by my legal team regarding the active federal warrants. Her father completely disowned her actions and explicitly refused to wire a single dollar to aid a federal fugitive. The sheer physical exhaustion and profound hunger eventually broke whatever remained of my son's arrogant pride. He was forced to scrape the absolute bottom of his contact list. He finally reached out to a distant cousin on his mother's side. This was a man Matthew had openly mocked for years because he drove a used car and worked a blue-collar job. Matthew swallowed his massive ego and literally begged this cousin for salvation. He cried over the internet connection, promising to pay back every single penny with massive interest if the cousin would just buy them a ticket home. The cousin reluctantly agreed, but he did not possess the funds to purchase premium first-class accommodations. He bought them the absolute cheapest budget economy tickets available on the global market. The itinerary was completely miserable. It involved 3 separate grueling layovers in crowded regional hubs and nearly 40 hours of continuous travel. They were assigned the very last row of the aircraft right next to the lavatories. They had no complimentary champagne. They had no private leather reclining seats. They were squeezed into tiny rigid chairs surrounded by the very working-class people they had spent their entire lives looking down upon. I sat in my secure home and watched the digital flight tracker update their agonizingly slow progress across the globe. I felt no pity visualizing their cramped, miserable journey. Every single ache in their muscles and every single moment of public humiliation was entirely earned. They were finally experiencing the exact level of discomfort and disrespect they had so freely inflicted upon me. But the airport floor and the budget airline seats were just the prelude. The true punishment was patiently waiting for them at the final arrival gate. They were finally flying back to America, completely unaware of the Federal Reception Committee standing by to welcome them home. The heavy wheels of the commercial airliner hit the tarmac with a violent jolt. Matthew and Amanda shuffled off the aircraft and stepped onto American soil. They were physically broken and mentally exhausted from the grueling multi-day transit. They smelled of stale sweat and cheap airplane coffee. They walked in absolute silence through the brightly lit, sterile corridors of the International Arrivals Terminal. Matthew carried his cheap plastic duty-free bag, staring blankly at the polished floor. He firmly believed the absolute worst part of his ordeal was finally over. He assumed he could simply sneak back into his house, take a long hot shower, and figure out a way to manipulate me in the morning. He still foolishly believed this was merely a severe family dispute that he could eventually smooth over with enough apologies and false promises. They entered the massive cavernous hall of the Customs and Border Protection checkpoint. The room was intimidating, filled with long, winding lines of exhausted travelers and elevated security booths. Amanda stood a few feet behind him, complaining softly about her swollen ankles and her ruined vacation. Matthew stepped up to the designated line. He approached the elevated wooden counter. He handed his blue passport to the uniformed federal officer. He offered a weak, tired smile, attempting to project the image of a normal, weary tourist returning from a long trip. The officer did not return the smile. He maintained a completely blank, professional expression. He opened the booklet and placed the laminated photo page flat against the glowing glass of the digital scanner. The machine silently read the biometric data and transmitted the information to the central government database. The officer looked up at his computer monitor. His eyes widened imperceptibly, but his rigorous training instantly took over. He did not say a single word to my son. He casually asked Matthew to place his right hand on the green fingerprint reader. While Matthew complied, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic digital red flag flashing across the screen, the officer pressed a silent emergency button hidden deep beneath the counter. The atmosphere in the massive hall shifted instantly. The subtle change in the air was palpable even to the surrounding tourists. Less than 15 seconds later, the heavy restricted access doors located to the left of the checkpoint swung open violently. 4 large men wearing dark tactical vests with bold federal insignia across their chests emerged from the secure hallway. They did not walk casually. They moved with a terrifying coordinated sprint directly toward Matthew. The heavy thud of their tactical boots echoing against the hard floors cut through the dull murmur of the tired crowd. Before Matthew could even turn his head to locate the source of the aggressive noise, a massive hand gripped the collar of his ruined designer jacket. The physical force was completely overwhelming. Matthew was violently spun around and slammed forcefully chest first against the nearest concrete structural pillar. The impact knocked the wind entirely out of his lungs, causing him to gasp for air. A senior federal agent barked a sharp, authoritative command explicitly identifying Matthew as a wanted fugitive. The agent listed the specific active warrants for first-degree grand theft auto and international wire fraud. Matthew tried to stammer a pathetic denial, but his voice was completely drowned out by the harsh metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs being forcefully ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The cold metal bit deeply into his skin, permanently severing his freedom. Amanda witnessed the entire violent spectacle from the edge of the baggage carousel. She dropped her remaining personal belongings onto the floor. Her initial confusion instantly morphed into sheer unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth and unleashed a piercing, hysterical scream. She screamed her husband's name and tried to run toward the security checkpoint. Two heavily armed airport police officers immediately stepped firmly into her path, physically blocking her advance. They raised their hands and issued a stern warning for her to stay exactly where she was. She was completely powerless. She stood trembling violently as she watched the federal agents drag Matthew away. His legs buckled beneath him, and his feet barely touched the polished floor as they hauled him through the restricted security doors. The heavy doors clicked shut, swallowing him completely into the federal justice system. Amanda was left standing entirely alone in the center of the massive, bustling airport. She possessed absolutely no physical currency. Her credit cards were entirely useless pieces of plastic. The wealthy, arrogant partner she had relied upon to fund her entitled lifestyle was gone. The absolute terrifying reality of her total isolation finally descended upon her. She sank to her knees on the cold floor, surrounded by strangers who offered absolutely no sympathy for her collapse. The county courthouse was a massive, brutalist structure constructed of gray concrete and thick-tinted glass. It was the exact opposite of the opulent desert resort my son had so desperately tried to claim as his rightful domain. I walked through the heavy metal detectors and rode the crowded elevator to the 4th floor, holding my posture perfectly straight. I did not wear a formal suit. I wore a simple, respectful button-down shirt and a pair of dark slacks. I did not need to dress like a millionaire to command the room. My corporate attorney Bradley was already waiting for me in the hallway outside courtroom number 7. He carried a single, slim, leather briefcase. He gave me a brief nod, indicating that the prosecution was fully prepared to execute the final legal maneuver. We walked through the swinging wooden doors and took our seats in the front row of the gallery directly behind the prosecution table. The heavy side door of the courtroom opened with a loud metallic clank. The bailiff led a line of chained inmates into the jury box for their preliminary arraignments. I spotted my son immediately. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. Matthew was entirely stripped of his tailored designer jackets and his expensive silk travel shirts. He was wearing a faded, oversized orange canvas jumpsuit issued by the county jail. His wrists and ankles were secured by heavy steel chains that rattled loudly with every single step he took. His hair was completely disheveled, and his face was pale and drawn from spending the last 48 hours inside a holding cell. He looked frantically around the gallery until his eyes finally locked onto mine. The sheer panic in his expression was completely undeniable. He practically threw his weight against the wooden railing separating us. He ignored the harsh warning from the bailiff and began to openly sob. He begged me for forgiveness, claiming he was incredibly sorry for the misunderstanding. He pleaded with me to tell the judge to let him go home, promising he would pay me back every single dollar. I sat perfectly still on the hard wooden bench. I did not break eye contact, but I also did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. I looked at the sobbing man in the orange uniform and felt absolutely nothing. The son I had raised died the moment he decided to sell his dead mother's legacy to fund a luxury vacation. The person standing in front of me was just a stranger facing the catastrophic consequences of his own limitless greed. The judge entered this room and struck the gavel, commanding absolute silence. Matthew was forced to sit down. His public defender, a visibly exhausted young lawyer, stood up and immediately attempted to secure a lenient bail arrangement. The defense argued that this was simply a complex family financial dispute that had unfortunately spiraled out of control. The lawyer claimed Matthew had deep ties to the local community and possessed absolutely no prior criminal record. Bradley did not even wait for the district attorney to respond. My lawyer stood up from the prosecution table and approached the center podium holding a thick manila folder. He spoke to the judge with the cold, surgical precision of a seasoned predator. He completely dismantled the pathetic narrative of a simple family misunderstanding. Bradley systematically produced the undeniable physical evidence my wife had so carefully curated. He handed the judge the officially notarized irrevocable trust documents, proving that the general power of attorney was a legally void and entirely fraudulent instrument. He then produced the forged vehicle title transfer, displaying my son's signature next to the vintage automotive broker's seal. Finally, Bradley submitted the certified digital banking logs, proving that Matthew had successfully wired nearly $100,000 of stolen funds across state lines. The mountain of federal felonies was entirely insurmountable. The judge adjusted his reading glasses and spent several long minutes reviewing the absolute flawless legal trap my wife had engineered. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew incredibly heavy. The judge looked down from the elevated bench directly at my son. The judge stated that the physical evidence of first-degree grand theft auto and international wire fraud was overwhelmingly conclusive. The public defender desperately tried to interrupt, to bring the conversation back to the topic of bail. The judge silenced the lawyer with a single sharp raise of his hand. He looked directly at the flight itinerary Bradley had included in the prosecution packet. The judge addressed Matthew in a booming, authoritative voice. He stated that a man who steals his grieving father's most prized possession to purchase first-class tickets to the United Arab Emirates is the exact definition of an extreme flight risk. The judge struck the wooden block with his heavy gavel. He explicitly denied bail and ordered Matthew to be remanded directly to the county penitentiary to await his federal trial. The bailiff grabbed my son by the shoulders and forcefully dragged him back through the heavy steel doors. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, echoing with absolute finality across the quiet courtroom. The legal proceedings moved on to the next case, but my personal war was officially concluded. I watched the empty space where my son had just been standing. The profound sense of justice completely washed away the lingering exhaustion in my bones. The trap had worked flawlessly. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the county courthouse and stepped out into the warm afternoon air. The transition from the sterile, oppressive atmosphere of the legal system to the vibrant, open world felt like taking my first real breath in over a decade. I did not feel the sudden euphoric rush of vindictive joy that I had secretly expected. There was no overwhelming urge to celebrate the destruction of my son. Instead, I felt a profound settling deep within my chest. It was a heavy, quiet peace. For years, I had walked around carrying the invisible, suffocating weight of my son's limitless expectations. I had constantly worried about his financial stability, his marriage, and his future, while completely ignoring my own deteriorating health. Standing on the wide concrete steps of the courthouse, I finally realized that the heavy burden was permanently gone. I had officially resigned from my involuntary position as his safety net. I walked slowly toward my parked sedan. The city moved rapidly around me, but my own internal metronome had finally slowed to a comfortable, steady rhythm. I thought about the man in the orange canvas uniform crying in the jury box. The sadness I felt for him was distant and entirely detached. It was the kind of sadness you feel when reading a tragic news story about a stranger who made a terrible, fatal mistake. I had spent my entire adult life trying to build a secure foundation for my family. Sarah had recognized long before her death that the foundation was solid, but the architect we raised was fundamentally flawed. She had given me the absolute ultimate gift. She did not just leave me a classic car and a protected trust fund. She gave me the undeniable, unvarnished truth. She gave me the profound permission to stop bleeding myself dry for a parasite. I started the engine of my daily commuter car and steered it away from the downtown financial district. The drive back to the vintage automotive gallery felt entirely different than it had a week ago. I was no longer racing against a ticking clock to prevent a catastrophic theft. I was taking a victory lap. I navigated the familiar industrial backroads with a light grip on the steering wheel. The fortified security system I had installed at my house was currently monitoring an empty, peaceful property. My financial accounts were completely secure and entirely severed from my son's toxic influence. The fortress was complete. The only remaining piece of the puzzle was reclaiming the physical manifestation of my wife's relentless dedication. I pulled into the pristine visitor parking lot of Leon's high-end dealership. The massive glass storefront windows reflected the bright afternoon sunlight. I walked through the heavy entry doors and was immediately greeted by the rich, familiar scent of premium leather conditioner and expensive carnauba wax. Leon was standing near the reception desk, speaking quietly with a prospective buyer. When he saw me enter the showroom, he immediately excused himself and walked over to shake my hand. He did not ask about the legal proceedings or pry into the details of my family tragedy. He simply looked at my relaxed posture and offered a warm, knowing smile. He recognized the distinct aura of a man who had successfully weathered a massive storm and emerged entirely intact on the other side. Leon gestured toward the secure detailing bays located at the rear of the building. We walked together down the wide, polished corridor. He informed me that since the legal hold had been officially cleared, his top technicians had spent the last 2 days treating the vehicle to a comprehensive premium detail. We arrived at the massive steel-reinforced door of the storage vault. Leon pressed a button on the wall keypad. The heavy metal door slowly ascended with a smooth mechanical hum. The dark, cavernous space was suddenly flooded with brilliant natural light pouring in from the massive open loading dock at the back of the room. Sitting perfectly centered in the bright square of sunlight was my wife's masterpiece. The candy apple red paint of the 1969 Mustang Mach-1 gleamed with a liquid, flawless intensity. Every single inch of the chrome bumper was polished to a mirror finish. The aggressive lines of the hood looked incredibly powerful and entirely triumphant. She was not just a restored classic car. She was the impenetrable vault that had successfully protected my future, and she was finally ready to go home. I stepped across the polished concrete floor of the secure vault and walked directly toward the driver's side door. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold chrome handle. The heavy metal door swung open with a solid mechanical weight that modern vehicles simply do not possess. I lowered myself into the pristine black leather bucket seat. The scent of vintage vinyl and my wife's favorite mechanical grease instantly surrounded me. It did not smell like a tragic memory or a lingering ghost. It smelled exactly like absolute victory. I gripped the thick wooden steering wheel. My hands were perfectly steady. I looked over at the passenger side dashboard, where the hidden compartment had successfully concealed the heavy fireproof envelope just a week ago. Sarah had built a flawless trap, and I had executed the detonation sequence without a single moment of weakness. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the original set of heavy silver keys. I slid the primary key into the ignition cylinder. I took one final deep breath. I turned my wrist and engaged the starter. The massive 8-cylinder engine roared to life with a violent, beautiful explosion of sound. The deep mechanical thunder echoed loudly against the concrete walls of the storage vault, completely shattering the quiet atmosphere of the dealership. It was the exact sound of a caged beast finally breaking completely free from its chains. The heavy vibration traveled up the steering column and resonated deep within my chest. For the first time in nearly a decade, I felt entirely powerful. I was no longer the quiet, invisible old man sitting in a suburban kitchen, waiting to be discarded by his own flesh and blood. I shifted the heavy manual transmission into gear. I steered the classic candy apple red muscle car out of the industrial warehouse and pulled directly onto the sunlit avenue. I rolled the windows down, letting the warm afternoon wind rush through the cabin. I bypassed the crowded city center and navigated toward the massive interstate highway heading out toward the open coastline. As I pressed my foot against the accelerator, the heavy machine surged forward with terrifying, effortless speed. I watched the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district shrink away in my rearview mirror. Inside one of those towering buildings, my corporate legal team was actively incinerating whatever remained of my son's fraudulent financial empire. inside a cold concrete cell on the other side of the county, my only child was wearing a standard-issue canvas uniform, shivering and waiting to face a federal judge. I did not look back. The open highway stretched out endlessly in front of me under a clear blue sky. Driving this magnificent machine, I finally understood the absolute necessity of the silent adjustment. Society constantly tells parents that they must endure any level of disrespect for the sake of maintaining a family. We are conditioned to forgive every theft, every insult, and every profound betrayal, because blood is supposed to be unconditionally sacred. But my wife knew the absolute truth, and now I know it too. When blood turns into a relentless parasite, you must completely sever the connection to survive. Matthew and his entitled wife believed they could strip my home bare and use my profound grief to fund a lavish international vacation. They thought their sheer arrogance was an impenetrable shield. Instead, their limitless greed became the exact weapon I used to completely destroy their freedom. They will spend the next several years locked inside federal penitentiaries, entirely stripped of their stolen wealth and their unearned social status. They will have absolutely nothing but the cold, terrifying reality of their choices to keep them company. Meanwhile, I am driving the exact priceless car they tried to steal, living inside a perfectly fortified home, completely protected by ironclad legal boundaries. I took back my entire life not by screaming or throwing a useless emotional tantrum, but by quietly using the law to crush them into absolute dust. My dignity is permanently restored, and my peace is finally absolute. I am Daniel, and this is my story of survival. If my journey resonated with you and you firmly believe that toxic family members deserve to face absolute, uncompromising justice, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with anyone who desperately needs the courage to stand up to an ungrateful child. Thank you so much for listening, and please always remember that your personal peace is a fortress worth protecting at absolutely any cost. The most difficult lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional access to your life, your resources, or your peace of mind. Society often pressures us to endlessly forgive our family members, conditioning us to believe that blood ties demand infinite sacrifice. But when a child views your love as a weakness to be exploited, continuing to provide for them is not parenting. It is enabling your own destruction. True dignity is found the moment you realize that setting an impenetrable boundary is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of profound self-respect and survival. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences of setting boundaries with toxic family members in the comments below.